Hi, this is Steve Worona, and you're listening to Campus Public Safety Online from the National Center for Campus Public Safety. Before I introduce today's session, here's a brief orientation to the Adobe Connect interface we're using. Your browser right now is showing the title slide for today's talk. On the left side of your screen, you'll see a box labeled Questions and Comments where you can read and type messages. There's a tab labeled Everyone at the bottom of that box, and that's the tab you'll use for all of your general messages, including questions and comments for our speaker. We'll be breaking for discussion several times during the presentation, so please do not hold your questions to the end. If you run into technical problems, you can request help in the box labeled Type Here for Technical Help. Someone will contact you directly to help solve your problem. We're also monitoring Twitter for your questions and comments. Use hashtag NCCPSwebinar. If you missed part of today's conversation, or if you want to see some or all of it again, this webinar is being recorded and captioned. The link will be available on the NCCPS webinars page in about a week. And watch your email for a link to a brief evaluation survey requesting your reactions and comments on today's session. Please take a minute to respond to that survey when the link arrives. We do appreciate your feedback. And now for our presentation. Today our topic is behavioral threat assessment and the need to keep campuses safe in the face of threats and other disturbing behavior. We're joined by Dr. Marisa Randazzo, principal and co-founder of Sigma Threat Management Associates, who is an international expert on threat assessment, targeted violence, and violence prevention. In addition to her work at Sigma, Marisa currently serves as Director of Threat Assessment for Georgetown University. Previously, she spent 10 years with the U.S. Secret Service, most recently as the agency's chief research psychologist. Among her various responsibilities, she co-directed the Safe School Initiative, a landmark federal study of school shootings that was conducted jointly by the U.S. Secret Service and U.S. Department of Education. She's co-author of 2 leading books on threat assessment, the Handbook for Campus Threat Assessment and Management Teams, and Implementing Behavioral Threat Assessment on Campus, a Virginia Tech demonstration project. She has testified before Congress and been interviewed by many national news outlets. She received her Ph.D. and master's degrees from Princeton University and her B.A. from Williams College. Marisa was awarded the Williams College Bicentennial Medal for her work in preventing violence and was recently honored as a distinguished alumna of the Spence School. Marisa Randazzo, welcome back to Campus Public Safety Online.
Steve, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be back with everyone. All right, let me go through what we're going to be tackling today. And I know we've had some folks sending questions already, and we'll also be taking questions that you can submit, as Steve has indicated. And I want to start out with just kind of giving you a brief overview of what we're going to be tackling within the hour we've got together. First, just a quick review of all the different places and sources that threats can come to our attention on campus. And I'm saying campus here, the bulk of the slide content that we have here focuses on colleges and universities, but these principles hold true for K-12 schools as well. And I know we've got some folks in attendance from public schools, from independent schools, and I want to make sure that that I address the applicability for your institutions as well. As we talk about behavioral threat assessment, this is a principle and a process that is just as applicable and considered to be just as much best practice for K-12 educational institutions as it is for colleges and universities. So we'll start first with an overview of where the threats come from and where our responsibility is for handling threats. Is it just internal? Does it include external threats? And how do we address those similarly if we can do so? We'll do a little bit on what is threat assessment, just the foundational information about what the process is, and really talk about why it is so important now more than ever to be using threat assessment in educational institutions to address threats of violence and other disturbing behavior that may raise concern about the potential for violence. We'll take a break at that point and do a little bit of Q&A, and then we're going to go on to understanding when to use threat assessment. Many institutions have multiple teams or may even have a broader-based team like a care team or a behavioral intervention team that has a broader mandate than just threat assessment. So we'll talk about when to use threat assessment, both for when should something be referred to your threat assessment team if you have a standalone threat assessment team, or when should your care team, your behavioral intervention team engage in the threat assessment process if you have a broader mandated team that also has responsibility for handling threats of violence and potentially dangerous behavior. And then we're going to talk about how to evaluate your own program. We have such a national awareness right now in the wake of the Parkland shooting, in the wake of Santa Fe High School shooting in Texas, of looking at the importance of making sure not only do we have a threat assessment capacity, but does it include the right components to make it as effective as possible. So we'll talk about ways that you can do, and you can take a checklist from these slides themselves. You can go back to your own institution and start to take a look at what do you have in place, how well is it working, and what might you need to add or enhance or change to make sure you've got the most effective program possible. And then before we get to our summary Q&A, we're going to talk about the impact of high-profile events, because when we have high-profile shootings like Parkland, like Santa Fe, like many other situations that we've seen, no matter where it occurs in the country or even in the world, but no matter where it occurs, especially within the U.S., we can see an impact on our own campuses. And so we'll talk about the ways that we may see that impact and how you can use threat assessment to respond to those incidents. When should you not? How do you remind people about reporting, and what things can you do in the wake of a high-profile incident to, again, remind all of your campus constituents about what you are doing to keep your campuses safe. We'll have a final summary Q&A, and I did neglect to say that we will also have a Q&A in between evaluating your program and then our final discussion about impact of high-profile events. So, as I mentioned before, you can submit your questions online. You can submit them through Twitter with the hashtag of #NCCPSwebinar. That's down at the bottom of your screen. And we'll get going into the content itself. So our title of our presentation is Handling Threats and Other Disturbing Behavior on Campus, and there are multiple places that disturbing behavior may come to campus and may be reported to your threat assessment team or to some entity on campus, be it campus police or campus security, to student affairs, to a provost office, whatever it may be. We see threats to campus and concerns about threatening or other disturbing behavior coming from a whole host of sources. So most often people think about potentially violent students when we think about campus violence and we think about campus threat assessment. But the fact of the matter is that campus threat assessment teams or behavioral intervention or care teams often see threats coming not just from students, but from a whole host of sources that we have listed here. So it may come to us because someone's concerned about behavior they see in a student, but it could be a former student. It could be a former student who had left the institution long ago. It may be a current student. It may be an applicant. We have cases where people show threatening behavior from applicants. We often see threatening behavior come from faculty, and again, it may be current faculty, maybe former faculty, maybe faculty who are on leave that we need to be able to address. We see campus threats come from staff, current and former, as well as applicants for staff positions, applicants for faculty positions. We often see, and people rarely talk about this aspect, that a threat to our campus may be to one of our employees, one of our students, but the threat itself may be coming from an estranged domestic partner that that student or that employee previously had been in a romantic relationship with or currently are in a romantic relationship with. We know that the risk of violence to estranged domestic partners is often greatest at their workplace. So as an employer or as the place that enrolls students, we know that an estranged partner can know fairly reliably that our campus is a location where they can find that partner and seek them out to do harm. We can use threat assessment to address those concerns as well. We have used threat assessment to address problematic, disturbing, threatening behavior that may come from parents. And when we talk about, as we move from sort of these direct parties of students, faculty, and staff to the less direct of domestic partners, parents, applicants, et cetera, what will switch in our threat assessment process will necessarily be where we seek out information. So the more directly we know a person, the more directly we can access information about them from different silos on campus, from residential living, from student affairs, from academic affairs, from student conduct, from human resources, etc. As we move down this list and we move in for further distance away from a direct relationship, we can still use the threat assessment process, but we're going to be using it with information from more external sources, such as inquiries with local law enforcement that our campus security or campus police may be in charge of. But just to wrap up the list here, we often see threats coming from affiliates. So we have vendors oftentimes on campus that may run our bookstores, that may run our food service. And those individuals have employees that may not be employees of the college or university, but that are employees of a company contracted with the college and university. But they still could do harm on our campuses. So we still have an ability to look into that behavior, and often it's in tandem with whatever parent company actually does employ that person. We see sources of campus threats coming from visitors. There are institutions that often have outside speakers that may be provocative or polarizing in some way, and that you will get threats that may come from someone who is intending on attending an event by that outside speaker and is not known to campus but has engaged in threatening behavior, or even if they don't plan on attending, we may get a completely external threat from someone even halfway around the world who is expressing a desire to kill a speaker that may be coming to our campus. Again, we can use the threat assessment process there, but we'll likely be working with outside information sources, including whatever your campus liaison person is with your local FBI office, which are often very, very helpful for external threats. And then also, we get false reports. So part of the process of campus threat assessment is to be able to rule out whether someone has made a report to a campus threat assessment team or a care team because they're trying to get someone else into trouble. And our fact-finding through the threat assessment process is what allows us to rule that out. So all of these different entities can report information to a threat assessment team or to a care team or behavioral intervention team that has threat assessment responsibilities. But likewise, that team can then go seek out information about the person that's been reported from all these different entities as well as others. So a threat assessment process and a threat assessment team is really designed, A, to receive information, but oftentimes we have people who are concerned about someone, concerned about behavior they may become aware of, and they don't really know what to do with it. So in that case, all we need for a threat assessment team or a threat assessment process to work is one report of someone being concerned, and they may even issue the report with the caveat of, this may be nothing, but I'm not sure what I'm seeing, and I don't want to get my colleague into trouble. I don't want to get my roommate into trouble. I don't want to get my friend into trouble, but I'm worried. The threat assessment team and process can then take that one report and start to reach out to all these different silos and entities on campus and beyond campus to look at, well, are other people concerned? What else is this person doing and saying? And then how do we piece it all together? And that's the process we'll talk about in just a little bit. So when we actually talk about threat assessment, it is important to understand it is a fact-finding process. There's often misconceptions about what threat assessment is. Is it profiling? Is it the same thing as sending someone to a mental health professional for a violence risk assessment? The answer to both those questions is no. It's not profiling. Profiling means we kind of compare the person that we're worried about with what someone else or with other people who've done this bad thing look like. Are they wearing black trench coats? Are they Asian male students? We often see reports that come to us because our campus constituents are doing their own profiling. They're worried about a student who may be on the autism spectrum or have Asperger's in the wake of, for example, the Sandy Hook shooting, or now speculation about the Parkland shooting. We saw an increase of reporting that came to us about concerns about Asian male students in the wake of the Virginia Tech shooting. So we may get an increase of reports based on people on our campuses doing their own profiling. But threat assessment itself is not profiling. We're not saying this person looks very similar, therefore they're dangerous. It is a fact fact-finding process that includes 4 major components. Efforts from the team to identify people in situations that raise concern, and that includes general awareness and making sure people know we have this process and we have this team. Once we have reports that we need to use threat assessment on, then we're gathering information. We're making inquiries, we're investigating. Essentially, we are doing fact-finding is that second component. We're trying to see who else knows something. And the reason that we do that is because in the wake of targeted violence and these mass shootings that have occurred in K-12 schools and on campus and in workplaces, there's been a lot of empirical research on those incidents. And as we've dissected them all, what we found is that a lot of people had concerns about that person prior to the violent incident, but didn't know where to report them. But when a threat assessment team or members of the team make a phone call, stop by someone's office, talk with people who know the person that they're looking into and ask, are you concerned? You get that information. So a key component of threat assessment, which differentiates it from behavioral intervention, from care teams, from other support capacities or other support-focused teams, is this requirement to gather more information from multiple sources, not just what the team knows around the table, but doing some legwork to figure out who else interacts with this person, who else is in a position to observe this person, and what information can we get from them. And then we go through a fairly systematic process of answering certain questions to analyze the information and answering questions to assess the information and assess whether the person or the situation of concern poses a threat of violence. Is this person on what we call the pathway to violence? Are they otherwise building the capacity to engage in violence? And if we think they are, then we go to this fourth and final step, taking steps to intervene, to manage the situation, to reduce any risk or threat that we see is posed. So for those of you working in campus threat assessment already, it is likely your experience, as it has been mine in this field for years, that many of the cases that I work on really involve the first 3 components. Once we assess someone, we don't think that there's a capacity for violence. We may see that they otherwise need some help or intervention, and we refer them to the appropriate department or appropriate resources to get that help, and we keep an eye on them. But there will be cases as you work in this process where you do have to get in and do active management. And I'm not saying that the team itself is responsible for managing, but the team is responsible for developing the best available management plan, getting the right resources and people involved to mitigate, and making sure those steps take place, making sure that action plan is implemented. So we're going to talk quickly about why to use threat assessment. There is now a greater consensus more than ever across the country about the need for threat assessment on campuses, colleges, universities, and K-12 institutions. And part of what we're going to cover here can help you make the case for establishing a threat assessment team or getting more training or getting resources for your team if you're struggling with doing so at your institution. Threat assessment really hit sort of the forefront of college and university awareness after the Virginia Tech shooting in 2007. And in the wake of that incident and the wake of the shooting at Northern Illinois University in 2008, there were a whole host of reports that came out from the Virginia Governor's Review Panel of the Virginia Tech incident, individual or a joint report that came out from the Secretary of Education, Justice, and Health and Human Services about the need for threat assessment. Various professional associations such as IACUIA and others came out with reports. Their blueprint for campus safety, for example, focuses on the importance of having threat assessment, among other elements, to enhance campus safety. We saw state task forces emerge on campus safety. And then in the wake of the Virginia Tech incident and the Northern Illinois incident in 2007 and 2008, we actually saw legislation passed in Virginia and Illinois, and then later in Connecticut after the Sandy Hook shooting, requiring threat assessment for their colleges and universities. For Virginia, it's just for their public colleges and universities. For Illinois, it's for all of their colleges and universities. So there is, at least in some states, a legal requirement. Now in the K-12 domain, we saw something similar after Sandy Hook, and now we're seeing the same thing after Parkland and Santa Fe, where we are seeing a wealth of concern and reports coming out of legislative committees. We just saw a report come out of Governor Abbott's office in Texas, a 40-point school safety plan that included school threat assessment training as a requirement for Texas schools. And we also saw legislation pass in Florida and in Maryland after a K-12 shooting in Maryland, right after the Parkland shooting, now requiring school threat assessment for their K-12 schools as well. So there's reaching this critical mass around the country about the importance of using threat assessment and really having the right tools and team and resources available to do this well for educational institutions. The last piece on the impetus, why we need to use threat assessment, comes from the fact that in 2010, there was an American National Standard approved by what is known as the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI. An American National Standard that's approved by ANSI is essentially either a commerce-focused requirement or a business or professional service process that has reached such consensus that they say that, yes, this is considered to be best practice. So there was one that was written for risk analysis for colleges and universities, for how colleges and universities can address a whole host of address and prepare for a whole host of natural disasters, man-made hazards, etc. It is a fairly broadly written American National Standard, but it includes very specific language that every college and university should have a threat assessment team or a threat assessment capacity. And it included two resources for handling those threats, the Handbook for Campus Threat Assessment and Management Teams, and Implementing Behavioral Threat Assessment on Campus, a Virginia Tech demonstration project. Those two resources happen to be books that my colleagues and I have co-authored, and the process that we document in those books is a process that is now recommended in this ANSI-approved American National Standard. An American National Standard doesn't hold the same force or weight as legislation. It doesn't require colleges and universities to have threat assessment teams, but an ANSI-approved American National Standard is often what is used as a benchmark in litigation if an institution is being sued for how they handled or failed to handle a situation of concern. So to be able to look at these resources, these two books, to be able to attend a training session that goes through the process laid out in these two books, for example, and the process is the same across these. You can actually just choose one if you want to. But to be able to say our campus includes the components recommended in these resources, includes training recommended in these resources, it helps to, first of all, ensure that you are really following best practice procedures for campus threat assessment, and also can help out from a liability standpoint as well. You did what you were supposed to do. So the recommendation here and the expectation, whether it's from the legislation or from the ANSI-approved national standard, is not that we will prevent every violent incident from happening, although threat assessment gives us our best opportunity to do so. The expectation is that we are going to do the best we can with the information we can gather and the objective assessment we can make and the intervention that we can coordinate if a situation needs intervention. And these resources help to lay out a process for how to do that, really a step-by-step guide for how we should be doing that. So before we go on to knowing when to use threat assessment, Steve, I think we're at a point where we can take a couple of questions.
Thanks, Marisa. Yes, we are listening to Dr. Marisa Randazzo. We are talking today about threat assessment. If you have questions or comments for Marisa, we have several breaks planned during the presentation. Type them into that blank line at the bottom of the questions and comments pod in the upper left corner of your screen. Marisa, should campus emergency management be involved in threat assessment, in the threat assessment team?
Absolutely. Campus emergency management can be part of the team or they can work in consultation with the team, but it is very important to understand that threat assessment is different from crisis management or emergency management. Threat assessment is really the capacity that you're building to try to prevent a crisis or emergency from happening. Emergency management is the team and the process you would use when something violent or some other hazard or disaster occurs on campus. So it's very important for emergency management personnel to know what threat assessment is and to sit in on some meetings. They may even become a regular part of the team, but it is also important for those two capacities to talk about when do we own this versus when do you own this.
Do you have any tips for gaining faculty buy-in for the program?
Yeah, absolutely. Faculty buy-in, often we see faculty come to this situation with a number of concerns that may or may not be sort of warranted. One is oftentimes we'll see faculty say, look, I don't want to report one of my students to you because I have a good relationship with them and because I don't want to lose that ability. Part of what we can do to help faculty understand is that this is primarily a support-focused process. We're going to look to find what tools and resources can best help someone who is considering engaging in violence, and that their involvement, that faculty member's involvement, may be a critical piece. So we're not going to want to separate or sort of distance someone from something that's already a positive influence for that person. So we can help by helping faculty understand this is not a star chamber mechanism. This is not a disciplinary process. And in fact, sometimes a threat assessment team will ask for student conduct to wait on proceeding through their normal procedures because doing so might increase risk beyond the levels that they could manage at that time, and to look to allow for some other intervention to take place first. Another thing that's important to understand for faculty is that this could be a very helpful tool for them to be able to engage a threat assessment process when they are facing classroom behavior that is not responding to their normal or their typical classroom management techniques and strategies. So if you can help faculty understand that this is a tool that can be helpful to them ultimately for maintaining good behavior in the classroom, we don't want every bad classroom behavior incident to be referred to a threat assessment team, but helping faculty who are resistant or reluctant to engage with the threat assessment team to know what it is they do can be very helpful. One thing we've seen teams do a great job of, and Virginia Tech really led the way for this when they established their team in 2008, was creating a frequently asked questions sheet, having it on a website, having it as a one-page or two-page flyer that can be downloaded, that really captures common questions that people ask of a threat assessment team when they don't really understand what it is they're being asked to do or what happens once they report information. So having an FAQ that you can hand out to faculty, to staff, to resident advisors, even to students can be very helpful for a team to develop.
Thanks, Marisa. Those of you listening, keep those questions coming. We won't lose them, but in the meantime, we'll let you get back to your presentation, Marisa.
Fantastic. Okay, so we often get questions as to when should you use threat assessment. Essentially, we will have reports coming into a threat assessment team that are appropriate for threat assessment. We have reports that may be coming into a team that may not be best placed with a threat assessment team or for using the threat assessment process. So let me walk you through what screening looks like for us in a threat assessment process. When a report comes in, we typically screen it for two elements. First and foremost, is this an emergency or an imminent situation? It doesn't happen often, but we do know of situations where the threat assessment team on campus was the only entity alerted about a potentially imminent situation. Something like, my roommate just stormed out. He said he's going to go get his weapon in his truck and go find the teacher, the faculty member that just failed him in the course, right? For something like that for us, this is a report that says we need some immediate containment. This is a campus police call. It's a 911 call. Yes, the threat assessment team will likely be engaged going forward, but because this is potentially crisis management and not threat assessment, we screen for that to say, look, is this something that needs to be addressed imminently? Do we see some imminence here, some emergency? Do we need to make sure the situation itself is stable before we engage the threat assessment process? So we screen reports for that element first. When a team is trying to figure out what does imminence look like and what situations will we use that in, it's very important to make sure they've got their campus law enforcement or campus security rep engaged in that conversation, and maybe even leadership from their campus police or campus public safety folks, because it is very helpful to know what would we do if we got a call for X, and you can work through a couple of hypotheticals. We often see campus threat assessment teams saying, imminence is sort of how the Supreme Court defines pornography. You'll know it when you see it. Well, we think some upfront conversations with campus public safety are going to be very important first to say, hey, if we get a call about this, what would you do? And then to know when you'd first pass it off, what situations you would first pass off to law enforcement for containment, and then what processes you'd then go to further screen for threat assessment. So screen for imminent or emergency situation. The second thing we screen for is the situation, as it's coming to us now, appropriate for the threat assessment process? And again, as we talk about the nuts and bolts of this process, these steps are just as relevant and usable in K-12 situations as they are in higher ed. For K-12, if you don't have a point of contact with your local law enforcement department, now is the time to get one. Reach out to your local police department or sheriff's office and find out who's going to be the best point of contact for you if you have a threat to your school, and start to establish that relationship now. Have them over to take a tour of the school, talk about building a threat assessment capacity, or if you have one, what it looks like. Make sure you've got a cell phone number, a mobile number, so you can reach that person when you need to. Now's the time to establish that contact if you don't. So we've gone through imminence, and then we go to see, is this appropriate for the threat assessment process itself? And essentially, when we do that, one thing that's very helpful for threat assessment teams to do is to try to come up with a clear definition of their jurisdiction or their team's scope. What situations should threat assessment be primarily responsible for handling or for coordinating? And what situations should they not be responsible for? This is a great exercise for a threat assessment team to go through. You may already have a mission statement, and your mission statement may clearly define what situations your team owns or not. But oftentimes teams don't, and we've seen many institutions have multiple teams, a care team or a behavioral intervention team and a threat assessment team, and there can create some legitimate, understandable confusion about which team owns what situation. So one of the things that that we helped Virginia Tech to do in the wake of their shooting in 2007 was they looked to establish a threat assessment team in addition to the robust care team that they already had in place. And one of the challenges for them was really trying to figure out who owned what. So we helped their threat assessment team and their care team work together in a big joint meeting to define the scope. What does threat assessment own versus what does the care team own? And for them, they came down to a dividing line of if there was a threat of potential violence or other behavior that raised someone's concern about potential violence, then the threat assessment team would take the lead on that. And if it was something short of that, if including self-harm only, if the only concern was about suicide or self-harm, then their care team would own that. And if at any point the team that took primary responsibility realized we've gotten more information and now know it looks different, it goes elsewhere, then they would refer that case over. They also did something very important, which was they made sure they had significant overlap across the two teams. So a number of people who served on the care team also sat on the threat assessment team to help make sure that a case that was referred to one team was where it was supposed to be and not that it should have been transferred elsewhere. They came up with one, they had this sort of scope in place for a while. They added a couple of parameters, and they came up with one that was actually important, that if there was a concern that was being handled by the care team, perhaps for a concern about self-harm or suicide only, but that it resulted in an involuntary psychiatric evaluation, or in Virginia it's called a TDO. If it resulted in that, if it got so significant that a court said, yes, we think this person needs to go in for an emergency psychiatric evaluation involuntarily, or they need to be involuntarily hospitalized, then the threat assessment team would take the lead on that case. So they came up with kind of general scope for both teams, some screening questions they could use. If we have any concern about any threat of violence, it goes to threat assessment, versus if it's just a concern, and I don't mean to say just, but if it's a concern about someone who's engaging in extensive cutting behavior, that belongs on the care team. So those are examples of how they would kind of bifurcate and refer those questions elsewhere. So it's important to have that in place, especially if you're working in an institution that has multiple teams, because there can easily be a situation that is referred to one team, and that team handles it as they would all the situations they are accustomed to handling. But yet, if it's appropriate instead to be referred to threat assessment, you want to make sure it gets there. One of the areas that we have seen colleges and universities be criticized on is having a threat assessment team but not using it, failing to use it in certain situations. This also applies to Title IX situations or VAWA-related investigations into sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. We are in the midst of shifting sands in terms of what colleges and universities are expected to do to handle those particular situations. But what we had seen is that in the wake of previous regulations, that colleges and universities stood up Title IX offices with Title IX coordinators and Title IX investigators who were primarily responsible for running investigations and swift investigations into any allegations of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, stalking. Primarily sexual assault, but it included these other acts of interpersonal violence. We also know that those situations often may include significant ongoing safety concerns that the Title IX processes weren't necessarily as adept to address as a campus threat assessment program was. So in the wake of Title IX expectations and regulations, we've seen another silo crop up. And threat assessment is really designed to help make sure information still flows across silos and to coordinate information among all those different silos and departments at a college or university. So one of the things that we've seen is to be important is active steps that a threat assessment team can take to do outreach to Title IX investigators and coordinators on campus to say, hey, we're here if you have an ongoing safety concern, and we really are the entity that should be addressing that safety concern. Not to say that threat assessment would then own the Title IX investigation at all, but that they could run a parallel process using information that was reasonably accessible from the Title IX process. You don't want to have multiple interviews going on, for example, but using information that was already available from the Title IX process or other entities on campus to evaluate ongoing safety concerns or potential for danger as a Title IX investigation unfolds, and to make safety recommendations while that investigation is still going on. So I've worked with a number of institutions around the country where they've had an ongoing and oftentimes lengthy and complex Title IX investigation, but significant immediate safety concerns for those involved, not only for a complainant, safety concerns for a respondent, safety concerns for the Title IX investigators, and safety concerns for the student conduct personnel who were involved in handling and that the hearing process involved. So using threat assessment can help you take a look kind of behind the scenes to say, as this is going on, what do we need to do to issue no contact orders? What do we need to do to provide emergency housing? Do we need to offer on-campus escorts? Do we need to ask that the hearing be held in a certain way so people can't see each other, they can hear each other but can't see each other? Different things that a team can look at to say, do we need to do anything? And if so, what can we do to help make sure that safety is maintained as this Title IX investigation proceeds? So having screening questions and conversations like that with Title IX can be very important as well as we help to figure out, is this a situation referred to us that is appropriate for the threat assessment team or for using the threat assessment process, or does it actually belong elsewhere? Okay. So in terms of evaluating your program, we talked about this American National Standard. The American National Standard, as I said, references these two books. And while the books have been published 10 years ago now, 9 or 10 years ago now, the principles and the processes remain just as valid as when they were first published. This is a process. In terms of behavioral threat assessment, it is a process that has been used for close to 40 years now by federal law enforcement, by some state law enforcement, more and more by state and local law enforcement. But it has been used for years now with only minor modifications. So there's often concern about, well, this reference is old. It is old because it is a well-established reference. There may be updates to some of the reference documents, for example, but just because the publishing date is from 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago doesn't mean that the procedure is not as valid. So one of the things that we have seen in the field of threat assessment is that there is such a robust level of case experience from people who have used this process all around the country and now internationally as well. And we are building more and more of an experience database with individual cases that really help to show time and again how well this process works. So going back to the American National Standard, to the components that are referenced in terms of what a best practice threat assessment program looks like. The components we have here apply both to higher ed and also to K-12 institutions. First and foremost, we need to make sure that the people involved in handling the situation is a multidisciplinary team. So you want to make sure that your team has representation from at least a couple of core areas, from people who are part of the institution's administration, so a dean of students, dean of academic affairs, for example, that you've got sort of school-based or campus-based administrators, that you have law enforcement expertise represented on the team, and that can be from your campus police department, public safety, campus security, and or from local law enforcement to make sure you have a point of contact you can establish a relationship with. And then you also need mental health expertise on the team. So you need to make sure that you've got someone from your counseling center, if you have one, your employee assistance program or faculty and staff assistance program if you have one. But also, if you don't, you can easily seek out assistance from mental health professionals within your community. We have seen time and again in the wake of high-profile shootings, mental health professionals, for example, through the American Psychological Association, offering their assistance. So you can easily seek out professionals who are willing to sit on your team on a pro bono basis or on a reduced fee basis just to provide some mental health expertise if you do not have that on your campus already. You can also seek out that expertise if you are in a small institution that is in a locality that's near a larger institution. You may be able to ask for someone to be loaned over to your team to sit in on meetings, and they can sit in on meetings by phone to provide that mental health expertise. One important caveat about this piece of it is that you want to make sure that you are not looking for a mental health provider that is already in a treating relationship with that student or that employee or that person that's raised concern. They're going to be bound by confidentiality and less able to work with the team. It's not that it's impossible, but they are bound by very important and high threshold confidentiality laws that protect the information they've gotten from their client or from their patient. What you really want is someone who can sit in on the team and say, okay, we're dealing with a case where we know this person has been diagnosed with X and they've gone off their medication. What behavior can we expect in that situation? Or this is behavior that looks like it might be X or Y or Z diagnosis and could benefit from some thorough evaluation and some treatment. Or we don't see any mental health or mental disorder components in this case, so we don't need to consider that aspect of it. So there are lots of different ways that expertise can be used that is completely different and separate from involving someone who's already treating the person of concern. Multidisciplinary teams on campuses often are much bigger than this, though. So we see involvement from from a provost office. We often see involvement from general counsel's office. We typically get a question, does someone from general counsel's office need to sit in on every meeting? And our answer is that it really depends on the institution and depends on the preference of your general counsel's office. You want to make sure that your team has access to general counsel guidance when they need it. And for some institutions, that means let's have someone sit in on every meeting. For other institutions, it is a much more at arm's length relationship where involve us when you need our guidance. But one thing that is very important is to make sure that whatever general counsel representation you have on your team sits through your threat assessment training so they understand what it is that the team is doing. So going further on from the team, it is important for the team to have some authority to engage in threat assessment. Some institutions choose to codify this in a formal policy statement. Others choose to do it less formally, but more simply through a letter from the college president, for example, to the individuals on the team, authorizing them to engage in threat assessment on behalf of the institution. a very important component for engaging in best practices for campus threat assessment is getting high-quality threat assessment and threat management training. And I'll go through some caveats we've got in just a minute about how to look for good trainers. And then having some process to follow. When cases come to a threat assessment team, they often move rapidly, and you want to make sure that you aren't missing any of the important points. You don't go immediately from initial report to what can we do to intervene from a threat management standpoint. You want to make sure you're still fact-finding, analyzing, reaching an assessment, and then going to intervention. So even just having a one-page checklist or a flow chart can be tremendously helpful for a team. You want to make sure your team has access to intervention resources on campus and off, and that you look for resources and start to establish those relationships if you don't already have them. And similarly to the ability to engage in case monitoring, and you want to make sure you've got additional resources that support threat assessment and operations, largely looking at making sure that you've got buy-in from the institution, and that you've got buy-in from leadership that say, yes, this is important and will help to make sure you do this well. So you can use this particular slide as a checklist when you go back to your campuses to say, what do we have in place? And to have some candid conversations around what's working well and what needs to be done differently or better or needs to be changed. And the ways that we can evaluate the different components of a program are actually myriad. There are lots of ways you can do it. You can do it through a team discussion or some after-action analyses about a particular incident that you thought the team handled very well, or incidents where the team felt like they had a near miss. Those discussions can be tremendously helpful and valuable. You can bring in some outside consultants to do an external review of a team process, and oftentimes when outside consultants are brought in, they may issue a report that will go to your general counsel's office, so it's considered to be privileged, and general counsel can determine how best to circulate that. There are some teams that issue annual reports that really look at usage over time, so how many reports came in from what aspects of campus. You can do some informal feedback from people who have reported situations to the team and ask them, what was that experience like, and are there things that we can do to make that experience better from a customer service standpoint. You can also do surveys of constituent groups about, do you even know we have a team? We see that in different campuses who will do that type of awareness around whistleblower capacities or reporting about incidents involving risk to minors, for example. So you can do the same thing for your threat assessment capacity as well. And then we can have some team discussions just within the team itself about recent high-profile incidents. What if that were to happen here? What did they see beforehand? If we saw that, what would we do? All of these mechanisms can be tremendously beneficial and informative for a team to look at how are we doing, and are there things that we can and should be doing better. Now, I mentioned before about getting access to high-quality training, and the same applies to if you're going to be bringing in any consultants to do an external review of your team or even to help you through a particularly complex case. What we see after high-profile incidents at colleges and universities and K-12 schools and workplaces is that we see experts pop up everywhere claiming to have expertise that they don't actually have, using the right buzzwords, but actually don't have the experience to back what it is that they say they can provide to a college or university or a K-12 school. So we've got 5 questions here, and this is actually a blog that we've got on the sigmatma.com website that you can download as well, about questions you should be asking anyone that you're going to bring in to help in a threat assessment capacity. People who actually have experience and have been working cases for a considerable period of time can answer these questions directly, and they should be able to do so. Anyone you bring in for threat assessment expertise should be able to answer these questions. So you want to know how much direct experience they have in handling cases individually. There's no clear answer, but we often think that having at least 10 years of experience working cases is is a good telling length of time. If someone's been handling cases for 1 or 2 years, I wouldn't want them coming in to train my team. Have them provide examples of cases they've worked on, and they shouldn't be able to hide behind, well, I can't share information, it's all confidential. They do not have to tell you any names or locations, but they can provide a sanitized explanation of examples of cases that they've worked on. You also want to know what their most challenging case was, or if they faced an intervention that didn't work, what did they do to fix it? For those of us who've worked in threat assessment, these are cases that we hit situations where our normal interventions don't work. We have to find workarounds. There's no high-quality threat assessment professional out there that hasn't had a particularly challenging case. If they say they haven't, they're lying to you, or they don't have the experience to back their claims. We also ask, what do your references say about you? What do you do well? What do you do poorly? And then also give me some references to verify your credentials. So it's important. You are bringing in people for their expertise to help you handle what are potentially life and death situations. So I want to make sure that you get the best quality expertise that you can. Steve, I think we have a minute or two for some questions here, and then we have a very short segment before we go to the rest of our Q&A.
We do, and we've already pointed out to folks that you have volunteered, Marisa, to accept questions by email for the large number that I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to during this hour, so I appreciate that offer. Mark Margolis wonders, what would you recommend to mental health crisis teams without easy access to threat assessment teams when they regularly encounter threats of violence in different form, in addition to suicide and self-harm? And William Wilkerson raises a related point. VCCS does not allow us to have counseling services on community college campuses. How do you compensate for that?
Excellent questions for both. So let me tackle the first one for Mark Margolis. Really what you can do is you as individual mental health professionals can get this threat assessment training as well, and you can use the same types of techniques seeking out collateral information from other sources if you don't have access to a threat assessment team. There's information that if you're asked to be doing a forensic evaluation, for example, there's information that you can seek out in terms of information about conduct, about criminal history, perceptions from external sources, etc. So if you go through threat assessment training, then you can really look at what else do we need to look at, or just go through something like the Campus Threat Assessment Handbook, or in K-12 the School Threat Assessment Guide written by the Secret Service and U.S. Department of Education. They offer good step-by-step fact-finding guidance about where to look for information, and then what questions to answer to analyze that information. For colleges and universities that don't have essentially a counseling capacity, we see this often. A couple of creative things we've seen done is partnering with a local university that may have a clinical psychology program and using some of their interns or residents under supervision to engage with your threat assessment team. We have seen a number of telemedicine type relationships crop up. State of Vermont for their K-12 schools often is challenged by very little local access to mental health professionals, but they are establishing a more robust network of mental health professionals that are available to sit in by phone call or by Skype or Zoom to sit with a team and help them think through some issues and help identify regional resources if they need some mental health intervention. For community colleges, commuter colleges, rural institutions, college or K-12 level, we often see this challenge, but we're seeing some creative solutions along those partnering and telemedicine lines. So let me go back to the impact of high-profile events. We've already talked about this a little bit, and then we'll return to the rest of our questions. What we have seen anecdotally in case experience, and there's been some systematic research, is that when a high-profile mass casualty event occurs somewhere in a similar institution, so a college to a college, or even other institutions in a K-12 domain, in a workplace, in the U.S. or elsewhere, if it gets a considerable amount of media attention, we can see ripple effects on our campus. And we see them in a number of ways. So we'll see increased reporting to the team regarding a whole host of concerning behavior. And we often don't see it in the 2 or 3 days following the high-profile event. We'll see almost a delay and then a real spike in reporting. There's certainly some colleges and universities that may see this right after, but for the ones that we work with, we often see a quiet couple of days and then a real spike in reporting, that all of a sudden faculty are looking at their students differently, staff are looking at their coworkers differently. People who've known about situations for months finally decide, I need to get this off my desk and get it to someone who can look at this more thoroughly. So we see an increase of reporting of concerning behavior generally. We often see, as I already mentioned, an increase of reports of people who look similar to whatever the perpetrator looked like in those high-profile incidents. And that is this sort of informal profiling that our campus personnel will often engage in. But we also see something that is important to understand. Places that have had mass casualty events themselves can become magnets for people from all over the world who want to come and be at that location. One of the very first threat assessment situations the new Virginia Tech threat assessment team or threat management team had to handle after their 2007 situation involves a faculty member from an institution in the Midwest with no relationship to Virginia Tech, but who was suicidal and felt drawn to this location. So he left a suicide note on his desk, took a bus to Blacksburg, Virginia, and the institution that found the suicide note alerted Virginia Tech, and they got their police department involved and their threat management team, their brand new threat management team involved to do an assessment and work with this individual because his desire was to kill himself on their campus in Blacksburg at the place where they had established their informal memorial. We often see that when reports come in the wake of high profile of incidents, they're coming in with an increased urgency by the people reporting them. They want answers and they want them yesterday. And so part of what we have to do as a threat assessment team, a threat management team, is to be able to help to provide some intermittent or immediate sort of victim assistance or reporter assistance to help them feel calmer as we work through our process. It is easy for a threat management team to feel driven by the urgency of their targets or victims. We also know that all of this can result in increased demand on a team that may also be facing limited resources, and that this impact can go on for quite a while. So when an incident happens, we often see these effects. One important thing that teams can do now, especially as we go into the summer months, is think about, okay, how do we size up? How do we make this scalable if we need to after the next high-profile event? Let's get some stuff out early about reminding people to report, but reminding them specifically about what to report. Let's make sure we've got our support resources on board. So if we need to if we need to refer a staff member who's feeling particularly scared to the Employee Assistance Program as we work through this process, we have the ability to do so. So just a quick summary, that threat assessment is really considered to be the best practice for preventing campus violence and K-12 violence and has been for quite some time. We've got great benchmarks that people can use for their program establishment and making sure that it goes to the right team and you use threat assessment when you should be using threat assessment is a critical piece to all of this. Steve, let's go over to any remaining questions we can fit in our 4 minutes. And as Steve has mentioned multiple times, my email address is being put in the scroll, so please feel free to email your questions directly and I'll get back to you.
And we've got about 30 seconds or maybe a minute before we have to do the wrap-up. So let me see if we can squeeze this one in. How do you determine or judge what is a credible situation for threat assessment?
Really, you've got to determine whether something's credible, you've got to dig into it and get some information, and that helps us to rule out false reports as well. There is nothing about an initial report, and we've often heard people use things like, well, if it's specific to time and place, then it's more credible than it's not. In my experience, working with school shooters, studying school shootings, studying campus shootings, handling cases for nearly 25 years, I have never seen something that easily defines it. So if you've got a report that meets your scope, you're going to get in and get more information, do that fact-finding piece of it, and then do your analysis to figure out, is this something or is this nothing, and how do we respond accordingly?
Thanks very much, Marisa, and thanks to all of our viewers and questioners from around the Internet. Check the NCCPS webinars page for a link to the captioned recording of today's presentation, as well as a link to our speaker's slides. The brief evaluation survey I mentioned earlier should already be in your mailbox. It will take you no more than 2 minutes to complete. Please do. We read and act on your comments. The next Campus Public Safety online webinar will take place from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, July 10th. Our speakers will be Madeline Sullivan, Management and Program Analyst with the Department of Education's Office of Safe and Healthy Students, and Janelle Hughes, Director of Communications with the REMS TA Center. Madeline and Janelle will be explaining how the REMS TA Center supports institutions of higher education. The registration URL is on your screen and clickable, or surf on over to the National Center webpage at nccpsafety.org. That's nccpsafety.org. And mark your calendar for our August webinar, 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time on August 14th, featuring Monty McKee, Philip Raymer, and Jennifer Skinner. Monty, Philip, and Jennifer are senior research associates with the Institution for Intergovernmental Research, and they'll be telling us about the Nationwide Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative. Again, register by clicking the URL on your screen or go through the NCCPS webpage at nccpsafety.org. Campus Public Safety Online is brought to you by the National Center for Campus Public Safety with support from the University of Vermont Continuing and Distance Education and the U.S. Department of Justice. Special thanks today to Andrea Young. This is Steve Worona. See you next time on Campus Public Safety Online.